On behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center Latin American Program, and also on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Washington office, I'm pleased to invite you to this very important discussion of money laundering in Central America. My name is Cindy Arnson. I'm director of the Latin American program here, and we're delighted to have you in attendance. I'm also especially pleased to introduce two colleagues from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Dr. Lars Hansel, the director of the Washington office, and Jack Egenhoff, who is the Konrad Adenauer Foundation representative for El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. They are sponsoring this visit by our Central American colleagues, and we're extremely grateful for your support of this initiative. The Red Centroamericana de Pensamientos y Incidencia, which thankfully has a shorter name, which is La Red, meaning network, is a network of 11 Central American research and policy organizations based in Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. La Red itself has its headquarters in Guatemala City. And the development of this network, I think, is especially welcome, and its very existence reflects the recognition that just as transnational crime knows no boundary, the efforts to investigate organized crime and to devise policies for confronting it must also be regional. Today we have two distinguished members of La Red, former Vice President of Guatemala, Eduardo Stein. Eduardo, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the Wilson Center, and also Enrique Sáenz, the Executive Director of Nicaragua's Fundación para el Desarrollo de Centroamérica, Fundesca, who will present a progress report and some initial findings of a second regional study of money laundering and its implications for regional security. They will be joined in presenting these findings by Mr. Egenhoff of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Before turning the microphone over to our speakers, I'd like to thank Julie Eubank of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, also Veronica Colon and Adam Stubbits of the Woodrow Wilson Center for their assistance in making this event possible. I'd also like to call to your attention a previous study by La Red on security and organized crime in Central America, which is available on the website of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. And for those of you who want to take note, it's www.kas.org.gt. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the microphone over first. Jack, you want to go ahead? Perfect.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you all for the interest, and especially for the cooperation of the Wilson Center to making this public debate possible on this topic that, from the perspective of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, is one of the topics that tackles the very heart of the development in Central America. It is an honor for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation to be accompanying the network of think tanks from Central America on this tour of seeking out to the public in the region and beyond, and it is a special honor to be today in Washington to debate these crucial topics for the future of the region. The title of the policy paper, which is still in the making, on money laundering, and the same title of the conference today, derives from an earlier study that has been distributed, I think, among you, which gives an overview of the challenges that the Red sees for the Central American societies and governments facing the establishment of organized crime, especially visibly rooted in the so-called Northern Triangle, the three countries of North Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I think it is not overestimating to state that organized crime is the most destabilizing element for the development of a democratic Central America. The driving force to form this network some 3 years ago in Central America came up in a debate between the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and one of its partner institutions, ACIES, a think tank based in Guatemala, and together with the Vice President Eduardo Stein, we reached out to the incredible amount of think tanks existing in the region, joining the force of knowledge and advocacy present in the region. And also we thought that we had to acknowledge the lack of a regional perspective on the challenges that faces Central America in its economic, social, and democratic development. Also, we think that the regional agenda in Central America, if there was one as a whole, was and is mainly set by a vision more upon the isthmus and not so much or rarely comes from within. So this gave the birth to this combination of think tanks gathering and putting together the knowledge that the region has. And La Red sees itself not only as an academic contribution to the discussion and debate in Central America and beyond, but also as centers and seeks to maintain a policy dialogue with decision makers in the region. For the Foundation, it is extremely important to link our work in our 100 offices all over the world to the dialogue on development, and especially on democratic development, that we're enhancing between Germany, Europe, and the United States here with our Washington office. So it is a great pleasure to be here today and to be accompanying two outstanding members of the Red to discuss this topic with you today. That is, as I said in the beginning, in a form touches the crucial element, the element of survival of the democracies in the region. Thank you very much.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes y buen provecho. Good afternoon, and may this meal be to your health.
Hey, 1 second. Can I mention, for those of you that need translation, we have headsets. So if you need translation from English to Spanish, there's headsets, and also from Spanish to English. Sorry, go ahead. Con permiso.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, for hosting this conversation. As she said in the introduction, this is still an ongoing investigation. We hope to have the policy paper ready by January of next year. So we thought important not only to give some information as to the findings that we can share so far on this specific topic of money laundering, but also because we thought it important to link this specific study that we're doing with the policy recommendations to our previous work and in general the work of La Red, the network. For some reason, we've always managed to produce in Central America hundreds of directives and agreements from the presidential level downward. We have more than 1,000 presidential directives emanating from the summits, of which less than 3% have been implemented or honored. The same is true in several areas of public administration in Central America. We have a lot of good laws, but very little action. And we found it to be so in the area of money laundering. We are not so bad in terms of our laws, directives, although it's a new field, but implementation-wise, we are still lagging quite behind. If we take an overview of what the region has undergone in recent years and what we have as countries done, as societies and as governments, we found that the capacities, the dexterities, the know-how of the different research institutions in Central America that not only do research, but that have as part of their charter and their objectives to do as well advocacy, was desaprovechada. How do you say that in English?
Not taken advantage
Not
of.
taken advantage of. And many times, regional directives and even the drafting of regional policy was just a simple sum of national interests. There was a big chunk of strategic reflection and strategic foresight missing from a lot of what we were agreeing upon. And several of the issues that we needed to tackle and try to solve, of course, demanded a lot of national and local work, but they were not solvable unless they also had a regional component. And that's what this network of think tanks and advocacy institutions are trying to do. Help governments, help our own regional organizations, but also help civil society organizations with this element or this input from a regional perspective. When we finished our paper on organized crime in Central America, we decided that we didn't have to delve heavily into what had already been done, but presented a set of 5 groups of proposals to governments and regional institutions. One of which, the first one at that, was precisely on transparency and specifically on money laundering. The product of our research then was so telling in this regard that one of the very practical ways in which we could approach the entire regional effort against organized crime in general, against the drug cartels in particular, was precisely tackling the trail of the money. And that's what we're intending to do in this research paper and in this policy paper. And we found that today, the foundation of the penal fight against money laundering is to hit national and transnational crime organization where it hurts them the most, but also where they are most vulnerable. And that is in their efforts to legitimize the illegal gains of their illegal activities. In order to make the use of the money, and criminal organizations are businesses, they disregard the law and any ethical framework, but they're businesses nonetheless. They want to enjoy the benefits of their business, and in order to do so without running the risk of getting hit by the authorities and being imprisoned, they need to legitimize the outcome of their illegal activities. So in this regard, following on our own recommendations, we decided to delve into money laundering. I'm going to very briefly outline some of the most important findings so far, although perhaps in a haphazard way, and give way to our other colleagues that have come with us today to accommodate some of your questions or comments. First of all, why did we decide to put so much attention, and how could we approach this type of policy paper so that the recommendations are usable, practical, are operationally feasible, and also, and perhaps more than anything, politically feasible? Well, Central America is one of the most dangerous regions in the world, and according to UNDP, one of the most violent, probably the most violent, if you use the type of standardized measurement yardsticks, one of which is the level of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are now today with the highest, certainly in America, in Latin America, and one of the highest in the world. And the problem for us as small societies is that organized crime and the narco cartels are not only stronger and swifter and wield enormous amounts of money and have no legal or geographical barriers. The real problem is that they are organizations that seek to institutionalize their operations and their regular and habitual power wielding through community activities and through business activities that are institutionally legal. That is why several years ago, not very long ago, they threatened elected mayors. Today, they no longer do that. They present their own candidates and they fund their own candidates' campaigns. So gradually, organized crime in Central America has been trying to co-opt official, regular, legal power structures. So it threatens the institutionality and the stability of the democratic state. It deprives our societies of pathways to honest jobs and honest income. But again, as businesses, they want to legitimize their gains and enjoy their profits. So, in fact, money laundering might not be a central political preoccupation for countries such as the United States, but for us, it has a demolishing corruptive power in our societies and in our institutions. In the recommendations of the previous paper, of course, we alluded to the need for structural changes to supersede the structural and economic and social conditions which produce and which determine exclusion from and the lack of opportunities for dignified living conditions. But in the control of the mechanisms for capital legitimation derived from the illegal activities, we found at least the following elements. First of all, Congress people and mayors in several of our countries are the main opposition elements to better legislation and to better transparency. These public structures and public offices have been so penetrated by organized crime in some of our Central American countries, and not only by drug-related cartels, but other type of criminal organizations, one of which, at least in my country, in Guatemala, shows to be the highest commanding element of money laundering in all the spectrum, which is corruption of public funds. In Guatemala, drug-related money laundering is third in the list, first being money laundering from illegal use of public funds in public investment projects. The second one being in extortion-related money which needs to be laundered in the system. So in this regard, we find that getting good, solid, and trustworthy information is difficult at the local government level. is difficult at congressional level because it is always opaque. Congress people do not want to be supervised. They don't want to be accountable in the use of funds in public investment projects. And the same is true with a lot of mayors, because Congress people and mayors, at least in 3 of the countries, have decided to create their own construction companies and their own NGOs, and a lot of the public funds go through their own businesses and NGOs in order to be spent locally to their benefit. A second element we found is that central government authorities were very, very cooperative in sharing information at a personal level, with the condition that they would not be quoted. So we have here not only a technical difficulty research-wise, because we have to deal with information that cannot be substantiated in academic terms. In other words, we cannot quote a former central bank president or a former superintendent of the banking system, or lawyers, or people who were really willing to share their experiences and their information, but do not want to be accountable in public for that information. Third element we found, which is very telling, is that, as I mentioned briefly before, there is a lot of good legislation in place already. We might be in a very unequal status regarding one country vis-a-vis another, but in general, in Central America, this theme of money laundering is getting a lot of attention. And in some countries, we have very modern legislation. The real problem is in implementation. Secondly, in bad coordination amongst different public institutions. And thirdly, because the quality of the information in general is not good and is not homogenized throughout a specific country, and much less throughout the region. This is a problem in general for public statistics. Fourthly, we found a clear asymmetry of capacities in those institutions that are responsible for following the trail of the money. To give you an example, in 3 of the countries, we have the Ministerio Público, the prosecutor's office, which has in each of the 3 countries a specialized bureau of investigation for criminal activities, and in these specialized bureau, an office for money laundering. The office for money laundering is understaffed, and the staff is undertrained. Mostly they are lawyers. They lack, for example, well, with no offense for the lawyers, they have started as that because the whole thing started as a penal preoccupation, a judiciary preoccupation. So they staff these offices with criminal lawyers. But they need other type of specialties there in accounting and in the analysis of financial operations. Whereas the office in the superintendency of the banking system has 6, 7, or 8 times more staff for money laundering investigation than at the General Prosecutor's Office. And lastly, there are very little resources. We have found that not enough public funds are put into these activities. Very, very recently, some of the countries enacted legislation for protection witness programs, for example. But the law is there, the funds to enact the law are not there. So we cannot protect witnesses in very high-profile cases unless we count with foreign aid. In this regard, specifically Canada has helped a lot with a very few emblematic cases, taking entire families over to Canada and creating a situation that is, for Central American countries, uncomfortable to say the least, because we are not putting the money where we want really to produce the changes. And the other major and complex difficulty we have found is that in Central America, and specifically in the four countries, Nicaragua, Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, our authorities decided several years ago that it was ridiculous to keep very stringent and very strict immigration procedures amongst our borders, because we had, between one country and another, 2, 3, maybe 4 at the most official pathways in which we had customs offices and immigration offices, and yet we had hundreds of what we called blind passages through which population went back and forth from one country to another. So the trans-border movement of people within Central American countries has always been intense, even in the worst years of the internal armed conflicts, where we had the army, as much as they could, taking care of the border control and patrolling. The passageways were very nutridos always. There were a lot of people crossing back and forth. And more recently, we signed free trade agreements amongst ourselves. We've had already free trade agreements in 98% of all the products. But in the signing with the United States and a few years afterwards with the European Union, we find ourselves that the legislation that is enacted for commerce or for trade, and the legislation which is enacted for the movement of people, is not congruent with the type of controls that organized crime would need, and specifically with the controls in money laundering. The amount of money that is being laundered through our financial systems is shrinking. In other words, there is indeed a reduction of money laundering through our financial systems proper. But they have found other areas in direct transferring of cash, transborder shipment of cash, so that we are seeing today, and with this I will end, as a very telling example, that the maras, the youth gangs that used to control territories and exact or get impuesto de guerra, they call it sometimes, war tax from bus companies, they are not longer doing so. They created their own bus companies and controlling their own territories. And even in the extortion business that they do very often at small quantities, you know, they might force a person that sells agricultural products in the market and might get probably the equivalent of $60 to $100 a day of income. Well, they might extort this lady for that amount of money, but the money will not be deposited in Guatemala or in Salvador, but in Honduras, and then take advantage of the cash flow mechanisms through regional banking that is now operational in Central America. Who takes care and who supervises transnational banking? That's one of the questions that we have asked in our study. Because contemporary economic flows have nurtured precisely in the free flow of electronic funds. And, well, part of the bubble that burst in 2008 was created precisely resting on this capacity to transborder data flows and transborder electronic money flows. But who is in control of that? Who can really supervise that all of the flow of funds that is occurring today worldwide doesn't have a very large component of illegal money? We were just at the Department of the Treasury this morning, and Enrique was asking at the end a very simple question. Taking into consideration that this problem is so central for us in Central America because of its colossal corruptive power, that it can indeed endanger the stability of our democracies, how important is money laundering in the United States? Or is it at all important? And curiously enough, they said it is important, but they never quite answered fully the question. It is important because it affects the dollar. It is important because most of money laundering operations occur in U.S. currency. It is important because it can indeed affect our trade system worldwide. But why it is important here that they have recently put so much attention to these criminal activities, so much so that with the little staff they have placed advisors in all of our Central American countries regarding business intelligence and money laundering activities. We still have a long way to go and a lot exchange of information to do amongst ourselves. So we're happy with the results we've found so far. We're worried that we are so ill prepared to enacting what we need to do in order to reduce and hopefully stop money laundering activities from illegal origins. But mainly, and I want to insist in this, because this is affecting the very fabric of our societies and our democracies. Thank you very much.
Voy a permitirme hablar en español. Cuando se abordan algunos temas, se corre el riesgo de banalizarlos cuando se relacionan con problemas más generales. Yo voy a correr ese riesgo, porque para nosotros el tema del lavado de dinero no es un tema aislado, sino que se encuentra también relacionado con el problema del desarrollo de nuestros países y con el problema de la democracia. ¿Por qué con relación al desarrollo? Nosotros en Centroamérica nos hemos planteado, y desde hace más de 50 años estamos en el empeño de la integración centroamericana, bajo el convencimiento de que nuestros países y nuestras economías solamente son viables integradas. Bueno, la integración económica supone fluidez de las relaciones comerciales, fluidez de las relaciones financieras, fluidez en general de las transacciones de bienes y servicios. Entonces necesitamos abrir fronteras, facilitar los flujos. Bueno, esa apertura ofrece las condiciones propicias para que también transiten flujos ilegales. ¿Cómo conciliar entonces la promoción y el fomento de la integración con el control de flujos financieros que podrían estar con un origen ilegal? Pero además del tema de la integración, todas las economías nuestras son sedientas de recursos de inversión externa. ¿Cómo conciliar entonces la necesidad de saciar esa sed de recursos de inversión de distinta magnitud, grandes, pequeños, medianos, con la necesidad de regular esos flujos? El riesgo en los dos casos está de mutilar el proceso de integración centroamericana o hacer más escasos recursos que ya son escasos. ¿Cómo enfrentar ese dilema? Es parte de la respuesta que tenemos que encontrar en Centroamérica. Esos dos ejemplos de la relación con el tema del desarrollo. Con el tema de la democracia, igual parecería una banalidad, el doctor Stein ya lo mencionaba, yo solamente voy a dar dos referencias concretas. A veces en Centroamérica, por la precariedad de las instituciones, nos toca, por así decirlo, dormir con el enemigo, en el sentido que las instituciones encargadas de tutelar nuestros derechos a veces son las que más amenazan esos derechos. Por ejemplo, en el caso de Nicaragua se aprobó una ley para combatir el crimen organizado y estaba establecido que los bienes incautados tenían que ser gestionados por un consejo. Mientras ese consejo no se integra, las instituciones que participan, si la policía captura dólares, ¿a quién le quedan esos dólares? ¿A la policía o a la fiscalía? O si se puso a la orden del Tribunal de Justicia, del Tribunal de Justicia. Como es un tema no regulado, son disputas permanentes entre las instituciones, quién se queda con los camiones, quién se queda con las haciendas, quién se queda con los dólares. Esa existencia de intereses creados ha impedido que se integre el consejo que va a administrar esos fondos. Solo lo coloco como uno de los ejemplos de lo que antes aseveraba el doctor Stein. La ley existe, pero no se aplica. ¿Por qué no se aplica? Por la existencia de intereses creados. Finalmente, en el caso de Centroamérica, nosotros tenemos que convivir con fantasmas de nuestra historia que se resisten a morir, fantasmas que creíamos enterrados y que ahora parece que están afanosos por resucitar, y nuevos fantasmas. En este caso me refiero al otro dilema, que es el dilema entre la preservación de derechos ciudadanos que son ya precarios y el combate al crimen organizado. Hay en algún país o en algunos países de Centroamérica unas tendencias autoritarias y antidemocráticas claras. Visto el instrumento de la extinción de dominio como una figura útil para combatir el tráfico ilícito de activos, yo podría preguntarme qué valor tendría en un régimen autoritario disponer de una ley de extinción de ilícitos. Básicamente le estaríamos dando un instrumento de represión, de confiscación y de acabar con la oposición política en un país que pueda transitar por senderos no democráticos. En consecuencia, para nosotros en Centroamérica no es una banalidad afirmar que el tema de el lavado de activos no es un tema ni aislado, ni es banalizarlo, relacionarlo con el tema del desarrollo y el tema de la democracia. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for these two opening presentations, a fairly sobering panorama that you have laid out. We have plenty of time for questions and answers and discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait for the microphone and let us know who you are. I'll start here. Mark, yeah. Lázaro Cárdenas.
Soy Lázaro Cárdenas, scholar aquí en el Woodrow Wilson Center. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español. Bueno, por un lado quiero decir que escuchándolos estoy oyendo de alguna manera la historia de mi propio país. Yo fui gobernador de un estado, Michoacán, de 4 millones de habitantes. Imagino a Michoacán sin el paraguas del Estado Nacional Mexicano y la situación es muy, muy similar que la que nos han relatado respecto a Centroamérica. Nos decía Eduardo que en relación al lavado de dinero en Centroamérica, en primer lugar está el dinero que tiene que ver con contratos de obra pública, etcétera. Segundo lugar, la extorsión y tercer lugar, el dinero propiamente producto del tráfico de drogas. Ahora, ¿hasta dónde estas tres variedades de lavado de dinero están vinculadas? Lo pregunto porque en México, como en el resto de nuestros países, ha habido tradicionalmente corrupción vinculada a la obra pública y a los contratos públicos, corrupción de la que han participado evidentemente funcionarios, pero también empresas de las más variadas, desde empresas muy bien establecidas hasta empresas menores, hasta empresas de reputación más dudosa. Ahora, a esto hay que agregar que las organizaciones de tráfico de drogas han ido cambiando su lógica y han ido tratando de apropiarse y de controlar todo tipo de actividades ilegales. Es decir, los extorsionadores independientes, los polleros, es decir, los traficantes de personas, conocidos como polleros o coyotes, independientes, los ladrones de mercancías, etcétera, independientes en México o en varias regiones de México han desaparecido y o dejan de realizar su actividad o la realizan bajo la lógica y bajo las órdenes de las grandes organizaciones de tráfico de drogas, que se han diversificado y han logrado controlar una variedad de actividades ilegales. Y esto lo observamos también en relación al dinero de obra pública. Nos decía Eduardo cómo han tratado de institucionalizar ciertas actividades las organizaciones criminales, cómo han tratado, y en algunos lugares han conseguido con éxito, y esto es válido para México, el controlar elecciones, poner a sus propios candidatos. Esto lo pudimos observar en México también, en algunos estados, en algunas regiones. Y al principio el interés principal de estos grupos era controlar la policía, es decir, poner ellos a su jefe de policía, habilitar a su gente como policías en algunos casos, pero comenzamos a observar en algunos lugares cómo estas organizaciones se interesaban por colocar también a los directores de obra pública, y esto no es casual. En la obra pública hay corrupción, es una vía para lavar dinero y es una actividad más adicional a la de la extorsión, adicional a la del narco. Entonces, esta realidad que pudimos ver en algunas partes de México, pues me lleva a la pregunta de hasta dónde extorsión, tráfico de drogas, lavado de dinero, producto de la obra o los contratos públicos, tienen alguna relación en el caso de Centroamérica.
Was such a meaty comment as well as question that rather than take a set of questions, I'll come back to David in a moment, but I'm just wondering if the panelists want to respond.
First, let me clarify the comment about the order of magnitude is in Guatemala specific. It does not reproduce quite the same in the rest of Central American countries. And if you'll allow me switch to Spanish here. Estos datos se derivan de las denuncias formales que se han presentado a las autoridades de inteligencia bancaria, a la instancia de verificación bancaria, y aquellas que han logrado sustanciar son las que clasifican en este orden. Pero las mismas autoridades bancarias en toda Centroamérica tienen la preocupación que tú nos has compartido. ¿Cuán interfuncionalizadas están las actividades criminales ya? Que quizás no sea posible realmente distinguir lo que es en específico un delito con fondos públicos en inversiones de infraestructura de lo que sean propiamente actividades relacionadas con el narcotráfico. Nosotros hemos preferido por ahora en la investigación mantener las diferencias porque la legislación nos obliga. Parte del problema es que las leyes que tenemos en cada país se originaron en problemas específicos que había que resolver, pero cuya magnitud era tan grande que necesitaban una ley. Por ejemplo, la ley contra el lavado de activos en Costa Rica se originó por una preocupación directamente vinculada con el narcotráfico. Ya no lo es más, o sea, se cambió la ley, se amplió, se modificó. Solo en 2 países centroamericanos existen leyes contra ¿cómo se llama? La de extinción de dominio. Illicit asset forfeiture. En inglés. En los otros países existen disposiciones legales, pero que se llaman de otra manera y que son parte de un cuerpo de legislación diferente. E institucionalmente también, en El Salvador, la oficina que se dedica al tema del lavado de dinero, cuando se creó, el superintendente de bancos estaba en la cárcel. Entonces no quisieron que esta oficina fuera parte de la superintendencia bancaria o la autoridad bancaria, sino la pusieron en el Ministerio Público. O sea, es parte del Ministerio Público. O sea, estas asimetrías que están presentes en Centroamérica nos obligan a formular recomendaciones que nazcan de la situación específica de lo posible en cada país, pero que nos vayamos acercando cada vez más a un manejo regional, porque en la medida en que podamos, en efecto, desarrollar mecanismos de supervisión y control regionales, en esa medida el agua que se rebalse financieramente de un país al otro no va a ser fácilmente legitimable. Pero con un país que no tenga este tipo de legislación, pues es hacia allá a donde van a fluir los capitales. Un último comentario que sé que Enrique, por su nacionalidad, quizás obvió, pero quisiera enfatizar este dilema que nosotros tenemos en América Central respecto de legislación de tipo confiscatorio que pone en la mano de autoridades no suficientemente sujetas a una supervisión democrática por órganos autónomos en el gobierno, lo cual implicaría poner en manos de un tirano en potencia o de una figura autoritaria en ejercicio un cuerpo de legislación que fácilmente ha sido usado ya en el pasado y no vemos por qué no sería en el futuro como un arma de control político y no necesariamente como un arma de sanción judicial frente a los delincuentes del crimen organizado. Como en Centroamérica hemos oído muchas serenatas y ha habido ya experiencias muy recientes, incluso en esta época democrática, de intentos de neutralización de la independencia de poderes. También nuestras recomendaciones tienen que tomar en cuenta esa precariedad política en la que todavía Centroamérica se encuentra.
Enrique, ¿quiere contestar? Okay. Back here, David Lewis.
Thank you. David Lewis with Manchester Trade here in Washington, and just like to congratulate the foundation, La Red, Wilson Center for excellent and cutting-edge research in terms of what's happening at the real economy. I guess, Eddie, what you're saying in a way is that economic integration and free trade doesn't equal real union in a region, because obviously there are many areas that are still lagging. You still don't have Social Security portability in Central America, for example. So free trade and regional economic integration doesn't give you the whole package. We started working around 2000 with OAS, IDB, and subsequently FELABAN, Federación Latinoamericana de Bancos, on precisely anti-money laundering compliance issues. And I think one of the big challenges you have is that the main concern and the main powers that be, particularly say from the U.S. with the Patriot Act after 2001, is if and when illegal monies or resources move from a region into the U.S. banking system, contagion, so to say. And that's where all the laws and the power in the U.S. stretch over with extraterritoriality. Treasury is important, but I would recommend where you really need to go is the Department of Justice, because it is Department of Justice and its attorneys statewide sitting in Albany, New York, who can decide one day that Manchester Trade Bank in Guatemala is moving money illegally. That's where they have the authority to literally close down any financial relationship between that bank and anybody in the United States. Unfortunately, for better or for worse, depending on your view, they have no authority to do anything with regards to that bank's actions in Guatemala or in Central America. So one of the challenges is that the capacity we have globally, the OECD, the Financial Action Task Force, there's one in the Caribbean, there's GAFI-Sud, I don't know what's going on in Central America, relate to the bilateral relationship. So as long as you don't contagion the Netherlands, the financial authorities in the Netherlands, don't worry about what you're doing with your people. So somewhere along the line, the capacity in region needs to maybe not match, but at least come up to standard, because if not, you're dealing with an unequal relationship of authority to make compliance work. So what we've seen in many, many countries is that the compliance works in the relationship with the other country, but the compliance does not work inside the country alone. And that is where organized crime has realized that what we do is, let's keep our money regionally. 10 years ago, that was not viable because Central America as a viable economic unit was barely starting. Today it is. 45 million people, $60 billion GNP. You can do illegal crime in Central America and never have to do anything with Europe or the United States ever. And therefore, that authority to control is missing. I'd like to know if you can tell us something about what's happening with financial action task force initiatives with Central America specifically. Thank you.
Another big question. I'm hesitant. Usually we take a couple of questions at a time, but I think it's so specific that I'd like to turn that back either to Enrique or
Very briefly. There is indeed a compliance effort from all the countries. We are all signatories of GAFI, and there is a GAFIC operating. Secondly, we are all signatories of both UN treaties or conventions, as well as the OAS Convention Against Corruption. And as I said a while ago, the problem is in the asymmetry of legislation enacted in each country, of the kind of institutions and their understaffing and underfunding to deal with these issues, and in sheer practicality. As I said at the very beginning, we do have good legislation in most countries, but the way in which it is implemented is still lagging way behind.
Okay. Let's take Carlos up here, if you could wait for the mic. And after that, we'll take Chris Ash in the back.
Carlos Indacochea. I have a very big question, and that is the United States seems to be very interested in what kind of money laundering is occurring in Central America or in South America or in Mongolia. The question really is what kind of money laundering is happening in the United States. And it is a very logical question because 80% of all the profits from the trafficking are realized in the United States, where the illegal substances reach the pinnacle of their prices. The size, the amount of money that needs to be laundered by that account is huge, and it could not possibly be laundered anywhere else. And we don't hear much about raising controls within the United States, apropos of money laundering in the United States from drug trafficking, yet all this interest in, say, Central America, where the needs of money laundering are even proportionally less, because after all, you need a flux of cash that symmetrical to the substances that travels in the opposite direction to oil the business. It is the profits that you want to launder, but you have to keep the business alive in cash. So it is very convenient that a lot of the money stays there in cash, oiling the business. And I don't think we're going to get very far if we do not look into how the money is, how the profits are realized in the United States, and how this 80% of the profits are laundered.
In the back, Chris Ash from the Department of State.
Hi, I have a question, and then I actually have a statement, but it'll be a short statement. The question, though, is, do you actually think, and this is to all the panel members, that the Central American leaders really want to address money laundering? The reason why I mention it, the Central American integration system in their security strategy they rolled out on June 22nd in Guatemala City that Secretary Clinton went to, not one of those programs is the issue of money laundering or financial crimes mentioned. And as we all know, the way you hurt criminals and you undermine their reason to exist is you take away the proceeds of their profits. You take away their assets. So does that speak to the willingness of Central American leaders that, frankly, this is something they know they should do, but it could actually adversely impact their personal pocketbooks, the people in political parties, and many of the corrupt people who I think you referenced earlier work in Central American governments? The other thing I was kind of disturbed by your reference twice to seized asset laws and the term authoritarian rule regimes. Seized asset laws are critical for Central America. They do need to be judicially monitored. We're actually working with the government of Guatemala on implementation of their seized asset law. The government of Honduras has a very effective seized asset law that's putting money back into law enforcement. So as we've seen in other countries around the world, Colombia, Italy, the United States, seize assets, directly take the funds away from the criminals. So I think we need to be responsible when we use the term that it's dangerous, authoritarian. We don't have that in Central America. If it happens, that's when civil society and citizens need to try to roll it back, which frankly civil society is very weak on the whole citizen safety engagement in Central America, which is a different issue, maybe for a different panel someday. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to throw in another question, which is, to my knowledge, El Salvador is the only economy in the region that's dollarized. And you mentioned Panama. Okay. Do you see, obviously, Eddie, you mentioned that Guatemala had, a more extreme manifestation of this problem than other countries. Do you see those countries that use U.S. currency as having a higher level of activity or problem with this? And then I'm going to go back. There was, let's see, Boz.
Hi, James Bosworth. I want to discuss briefly the intersection between money laundering and gambling in the region, because I find that to be, I realize construction and public funds is very important, but also the whole gambling aspect becomes important. The murder of Facundo Cabral in Guatemala was linked directly to nightclubs and gambling, also forged document rings. In Mexico with the Zetas attacking the casino, that was more of an extortion plot, but there was also some money laundering aspects. In Costa Rica, gambling websites, poker websites that are very available have been linked to money laundering going from the United States down to Central America. So both offline and online, how are these casinos, how are gambling laws affected by money laundering and vice versa? And is there a move to reform the gambling structure in Central America to try to stop money laundering?
Okay. And then for this panel, we'll take one more question here from Julie Lopez of Plaza Pública.
Julie López, periodista. Quisiera hacer un comentario y un par de preguntas muy puntuales. Un comentario sobre el tema de lavado de dinero en Estados Unidos. Un ejemplo muy breve ha sido cómo rastrearon dinero que fue enviado de casas de cambio desde México hasta Estados Unidos para comprar aviones para después regresarlos a Latinoamérica y transportar drogas para Centroamérica y para México. Estos aviones fueron comprados en Estados Unidos y enviados hacia Centroamérica y Sudamérica. Entonces, este es un ejemplo que sí ha seguido el Departamento de Justicia y son casos que llevan los U.S. Attorney's Office en diferentes estados según los sitios a donde ha sido enviado el dinero. Una de las preguntas comentario que tengo es si en Guatemala el hecho de que el narcotráfico ocupa el tercer lugar en términos de fuente de lavado de dinero en el país podría deberse a que una buena parte del dinero no pasa por el sistema bancario, sino pasa por Guatemala en efectivo y después es trasladado por los puntos ciegos a México o al resto de Centroamérica. Y esto está conectado con este caso de los aviones, porque el mismo año que descubrieron uno de estos casos, por cierto, conectado con el Banco de América en Estados Unidos, en Oklahoma en particular, ese mismo año descubrieron $14 millones en una casa en la capital. Y era el mismo grupo que estaba enviando dinero para México y después para Estados Unidos. La otra pregunta es si en las recomendaciones se ha considerado el trabajo entre Centroamérica y México, dada la conexión y el flujo de dinero en efectivo, no necesariamente por medio del sistema bancario, ¿no? Creo que en el último año o 2 años se descubrieron X cantidades de dólares en El Salvador y en Guatemala, no recuerdo si en Honduras también, y podría ser un ejemplo de esto. Gracias.
Por favor. Enrique.
I think I'm going to eat my lunch and let my colleagues answer the questions. Let me start by the question that Cynthia posed. Being dollarized or not has nothing to do. The fluidity with which money conversion is operating nowadays makes it almost irrelevant, but not totally irrelevant. And the other aspect at the outset I want to comment on is that it is not that the U.S. authorities are only worried about money laundering elsewhere. We have clear indication that U.S. authorities are as well worried about what's going on in the U.S. economy. And this morning at the Treasury, just to give you the last example in our research trail, they gave us a clear indication that they are aware that the largest amount of money being laundered is laundered in the United States. But it is the interconnectedness in such uneven systems that makes it an even more dangerous set of operations, because they touch immediately the legality of hundreds of thousands of enterprises and even public institutions. And that is why, at least from our end, both public institutions and private organizations are extremely concerned about the damaging capability of these operations. Thirdly, I am at odds reacting to the 2 questions or comments from the person from the State Department. Because we, as a network of centros de pensamiento e incidencia, provided several recommendations to the summit that occurred in Guatemala a few months ago, and most of which were totally disregarded anyway. So we were not only frustrated, but also intrigued by what had happened. Where were the cracks where all of these materials fell through? And why didn't they get to the decision makers' table? On the one hand, the whole summit of presidents was organized more around photo opportunities. I'm sorry to say these, but the real content discussions that we thought would occur amongst the presidents were absent. It was more of a protocol agenda that was led in, and also because they have already agreed on 20 regional projects, none of which, as you well mentioned, touches on money laundering. They took a long time, several months, to get to an agreement amongst more than 100 regional projects or national interest projects disguised as regional, to finally arrive at a consensus of which 20 they were going to present to the international community. So, indeed, there's a lot of work to be done here, and there is a lot of exchange of experiences and information to be gained. But the second element, although you mentioned it first, is a question that we all ask ourselves. Are Central American leaders really committed to address the problem of money laundering. I would ask the Central American leaders. I think that in the type of agenda renovation that is going on in the region, the authorities that have to do with these issues are, in general, very sincere. This is what we have found. But they are up against a lot of complications that are not only budgetary but also legal. And this would entail a very long discussion of qué viene primero, si el huevo o la gallina, ¿no? But it has to do with our legal systems. It has to do with the way in which laws are discussed and approved in Congress, and the reluctance, as I mentioned before, of Congress to delve into better legislation for transparency and accountability. The specific element about putting in the hands of an authoritarian political figure, democratically elected, quote unquote, laws that are prone to abuse without proper supervision is very present in Central America today. We had elections in Guatemala on Sunday as well as in Nicaragua. To the best of my knowledge, the Nicaraguan elections, although the result was overwhelming, have a very large gray area of non-compliance with democratic transparency, that even the OAS observation mission was able to pinpoint at 2 o'clock in the afternoon before the voting was finished. They were not allowed, having 52 supervisory points. In 10 of them, they were not allowed in. And yet, in the evening, Secretary General Insulza was congratulating Nicaraguans for the electoral result. I don't see how these things match, but we are still with a lot of worries in Central America regarding democratic equilibrium and independence of powers. I would really like my colleagues to intervene. They have a lot of personal and institutional experience in their own countries. Let me just make one last comment about money laundering and gambling and the death of Facundo Cabral in Guatemala. We have found through our study that one of the money laundering mechanisms that has operated without any scrutiny for years is the organization and implementation of international concerts. Big names in the entertainment business, like Facundo Cabral, come to our capital cities and they give out very acudidos, concerts, well-attended concerts. There is no supervision, even to the level of reported attendance tickets. No one ever checks if the number of tickets sold are equal to the people that went to the concert. So you can report to the authorities and pay taxes for, let's say, 6,000 people who attended, and maybe only, or tickets sold, and maybe only 2,000 went to the concert. That type of stuff goes on every week in Central America. The death of Facundo Cabral was because he was seated in the car seat where he shouldn't have, because the person that was intended to be killed was the owner of this network of prostitution houses and game houses throughout Central America, who probably uses concerts throughout Central America to launder money. And because he is known and his network, with the participation of different nationalities, to organize very impressive concerts with international stars. But perhaps the question is not necessarily about the laws governing juegos de azar or
Gaming.
or gambling. Those laws are very strict, and in several countries, gambling is not allowed at all. It's against the law. But it happens. It occurs in every feria, in every national holiday or in a local festivity of the patron saint of any city. You find people gambling. It's part of the celebration of the fair, and this is not regulated at all. I'd say, however, that maybe we will never arrive at hard facts on how much money is laundered through gambling in Central America today. It is impossible to get, but we are finding other areas in which, like in the concerts, we never thought that they would be used as money laundering devices. Sorry.
Enrique, ¿quiere?
Sí, solamente dos comentarios. A propósito del caso de Facundo Cabral, ilustra la dimensión del problema. La persona buscada y acusada como autor intelectual es de nacionalidad costarricense. La persona que se supone iba a ser victimizada es de nacionalidad nicaragüense. Quienes empuñaron las armas son guatemaltecos y la víctima argentina. Ese caso seguramente ilustra la dimensión transnacional del problema, y esto me lleva a lo que planteaba Julie sobre el tema de México. En algunas de las entrevistas que como Red hemos sostenido, alguien mencionó, no garantizo las cifras, solamente reproduzco lo que se nos dijo, que se estimaba que en México se lavaban alrededor de 36 mil millones de dólares y que con la política de combate en México, repito, no respondo por las cifras, solamente estoy reproduciendo algo que nos informó un funcionario, y que ahora se estimaba que se había trasladado aproximadamente 6 mil millones a Centroamérica. Esto combino los dos elementos que definitivamente no solo con Estados Unidos, también con México y con Colombia en la parte del tráfico, pero nosotros también hemos planteado que también otros países de América del Sur que son productores y también destinatarios de los beneficios tienen que ser incorporados en esta dimensión, porque al fin y al cabo nosotros como centroamericanos no somos productores de una buena parte de nuestros problemas y en consecuencia debemos responder por ellos. Pero de este problema nosotros solo somos receptores, porque ni somos, salvo unas muy marginales, no somos los grandes productores, ni somos los grandes consumidores, ni somos tampoco los grandes lavadores, pero nuestra situación es tan frágil que las tres repercusiones tienen o pueden tener un efecto demoledor en nuestras sociedades.
Chuck, you also wanted to say something.
I just wanted to comment on the question of if there is political will to address money laundering in Central America, which is obviously a key question. I think there's one actor here that we have left out of the discussion, and those are the political parties in Central America. Obviously, as a political foundation, our main target of our work are political parties that we could consider strategic partners. We lack a lot of those in Central America, which obviously points at the state of the political parties in Central America, especially in Guatemala. But we are actually taking all these results from the first study on organized crime and debate them with our political partners and political parties in Honduras and throughout the region. It is a very, very difficult discussion because if you go, it's still possible to enhance this debate on a national level. But if you go down to the municipal level, it becomes, let's say, dangerous for those who endeavor in that. But nevertheless, I think that's one of our tasks as Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to tackle these problems also with those actors that, in the end of the discussion, are those decision makers in Congress that would pass or prevent passing these laws. That's one thing, and I think the mentioning Mexico and Colombia is crucial. Obviously, in our discussions with the network, we see that we are limited if we don't look at Mexico and Colombia. So we are thinking about it, not necessarily to expand the network to those countries, but yes, inviting decision makers and the academia to help us to tackle the problem from a broader perspective.
Okay, sure. Jim Michael here up front.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on this question of political will. We sometimes talk about political will as if it is something that, do they really want to or don't they want to, and they'll turn it on or they'll turn it off. But it's a much more complicated process. And we like to think that democratic development, economic development, social development creates incentives for more accountability in a society and a better informed populace. And the political dynamic changes so that what used to be acceptable is no longer tolerated. I just wonder to what extent you see the political environment in which it is the people of Central America who suffer from this, and to what extent are the people of Central America responding to this frustration, the weakness of institutions, the lack of congruence among the countries in the way they are able to work together. To what extent has this been an issue in the elections that have just taken place? To what extent is it an issue in the press, in the media? And I recognize that there are issues of intimidation and capture of legitimate businesses by illicit forces, but at the same time, there has to be some pushback that will provide some political space for the kinds of recommendations that you're putting forward. And also, incidentally, but I think a much smaller part of the equation is what can international cooperation do to support your efforts. But it really seems to me has to come from some evolution within the region of a determination to take this on and to overcome those obstacles, not disregarding them and recognizing how important they are. But what is the political environment? As I say, what do you see in how the populace and the political establishment is responding to this? Is it just accepting it, or do you see signs of intolerance to this kind of imposition on the people of Central America?
Have any other questions? Sure, right here.
Edith Houston, USAID. I find the comment about working at the local level with political actors versus the national very interesting, because as a member of the international community, the donor community, a lot of us have found there are more inroads at the local level in terms of development than at the national level because of there are fewer complexities when you bring development down to the community level. So I would be interested in expounding on that that comment because I find it very intriguing. Thank you.
And then over on this side.
Susan Salaya from the International Republican Institute. I'm very interested in this question of civil society and its role in oversight, and I'm wondering if the panel can comment on the capacity of civil society in Central America to fulfill their role, essentially, in conducting oversight of the different institutions.
And in turning back to our panel, I'd like to also recognize the presence of other members of the delegation from Central America. We have 3 colleagues from Guatemala, Carlos Humberto González, from Macías, José Carmelo Torreviarte, over there, thank you, Maria Concepción Castro, she is here, but she stepped out for a moment, José Ángel Tolentino from Funde in El Salvador, and Carlos Rivera from Costa Rica. Thank you. Over.
Let me make a general comment about the last group of questions or commentaries. When you approach one of these areas of complexity and begin to measure the dire consequences in any region's political system, it's like when a doctor approaches from a clinical standpoint a systemic disease in an organism. But the organism keeps working, and maybe in just talking about the disease, one tends to forget that there are other things that might be working well. Otherwise, the person would be dead. So there is indeed a lot of progress, fortunately, in Central America in recent years since we did away with the internal armed conflicts. We have progressed in democratic sustenance, and we have indeed honed our electoral processes, so much so that maybe in the near future international oversight will no longer be necessary because internal supervision has grown stronger, and that is carried out by civil society organizations. Secondly, we have also made inroads in a positive sense in general development and the reduction of inequality, which is even more important in 3 of our countries. Not only the reduction of poverty, but the reduction of inequality. And speaking about the capacity of civil society to perform this type of oversight, there's been in recent years striking examples in 5 of our countries in which civil society organizations indeed either stopped very ill-informed public decisions or promoted very important and developmentally important public decisions. In this regard, I would like to make 3 comments. I would say that population-wise, the different sectors of Central American societies in the different countries are very concerned about the effects of criminal organizations. But they perhaps don't have insight into the innards of how they operate and the type of incursions within public and private organizations that organized crime has made. So what they're asking from their governments is to solve the insecurity situation or or the upsurge of criminal acts in the streets, but they might not be aware of the technical aspects of things like the mechanisms of money laundering and the damage that it can do to our democratic systems. So I would say they are as engaged as their public information and their experience at the community level allows them to be. And the fact that the growth in electoral participation has also shown consistently in recent years in Central America is also a good indicator that there is a growing concern. Now, in 4 of the countries, excepting Panama and Costa Rica, the population is very, very young. 70% of the population of Nicaragua, Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala are 30 years or younger. So, in a country with this democratic profile, and in a region with this democratic profile, the role of youth is very important, and all political parties pay lip service to this, but very, very few do something about including and engaging youth movements or servicing youth movements in a constructive political way. They just want their votes. And just for the voting day, the rest of the 4 or 5 years, they couldn't care less about them. And yet, there is an upsurge of youth organizations throughout Central America with a weird combination. There is a general disregard of political parties and political traditional activities, and yet there is a willingness to engage in aspects of public life that are political, but that the youngsters do not regard as something within the political parties' programs, which is also a very bad comment about political parties, but they're willing to engage, and that's also very important. The discussion about the local and national level is a never-ending discussion. I would say that for development purposes, the local level is by far much better ground to do important and constructive work. But there are issues that can only be dealt with at a national level, and for our concerns at a regional level as well. And to fight criminal activities that are transborderly organized can only be done with very good level of not only political consensus, but action-oriented determination, which is similar, if not identical, in all the countries. And my last comment has to do with specifically this aspect. Presidents tend to be very, very jealous about their own turf. They meet with other presidents, they agree on things, they sign declarations, and many times they are very sincere about what they do. But when they go back to their countries, they go back to a jungle of pressures and demands on their offices, and they do not have yet in Central American countries an effective mechanism to follow up on regional decisions in every country. In other words, we do not need, we do not have, and we do need a combination of institutions or specific offices that can do the seguimiento to the regional agreements and decisions. It just disappears, evaporates, because when they go back, as they are hopping on the plane that will take them back, they are on the 3 or 4 cellular phones getting calls from many of their ministers, and they forget about the regional aspects of the agenda until the next fire erupts or the next meeting is scheduled. And in this regard, I'd say that some international organizations from donor countries, whether government-sponsored or not, have been with us for many, many years, sometimes nurturing in the best directions our political system and the training of our leadership. Sometimes they have assumed a very ugly responsibility, which is to denounce things that are not going on the right direction, or make criticisms about our own behavior. And in this regard, I don't want to name names, but there are several of them which have been working directly with local level but regional reach programs which have been immensely successful. And in my country proper, the work with indigenous peoples in the last 25 years has really paid off in this regard. I would say that we have never faced in recent years the level of engagement as well as the awareness of their own rights of the 22 linguistic groups that we have in Guatemala. And proof of it in the last elections is that the level of attendance of voters, registered voters, is the highest ever in our democratic era in my country, and the percentage of registered indigenous voters is the highest. I don't know if this helps to at least clarify some of the questions. I insist, I need my colleagues to... Carlos would like to make a comment.
I'm going to allow one other question because I see somebody who's very intent.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Yo quisiera primero felicitar al Wilson Center por el estudio recién realizado sobre el crimen organizado en el Triángulo Norte de Centroamérica, editado en septiembre. Creo que hace a pesar de lo que decía el doctor Stein, la dificultad que hay de obtener buena información confiable, creo que es un esfuerzo muy loable y describe con bastante aproximación, diría yo, los últimos acontecimientos políticos y cómo el crimen organizado se ha ido entronizando en los países y las redes que ya tejieron.
Also, if I could just mention, he was just mentioning a publication on organized crime in Central America that is due back from the printer any day. It's available on our website, but we have two of the authors of the Honduras chapter, the Guatemala chapter here with us, James Bosworth on Honduras, Julie Lopez on Guatemala.
Okay. Y luego hubo algunas preguntas en relación a bancos. Yo quisiera comentar algunas cosas. Primero, pues, quizá no solo en Guatemala, creo que en todo el mundo las acciones de los bancos, el capital accionario son nominativos, o sea, hasta donde uno cree, pues se sabe en cualquier momento quiénes son los dueños de los bancos. Y en cuanto a en qué medida el narcotráfico utiliza o se vale de los bancos para lavar dinero, es un poco difícil. Yo diría, a la pregunta que hizo la señorita López, diría que quizá la mayor parte del lavado de dinero ocurre fuera del sistema bancario, al menos en Guatemala, porque pensaría que las medidas últimas que se han tomado han indicado de que hay una reducción en esta utilización de los bancos. Por ejemplo, es interesante una medida que tomó la Superintendencia de Bancos a finales del año pasado, la Junta Monetaria, que exigía al sistema bancario, se le exigía una declaración de la persona que vendía o compra dólares, arriba de 10,000 o más dólares. Esa disposición se redujo a 3,000 a partir de enero. Y entonces, por ejemplo, en diciembre de 2009, en ese mes, los bancos compraron en efectivo, me refiero a operaciones en efectivo, compraron 166 millones de dólares. En julio de 2010, 149. En diciembre de 2010, 131 millones. Y la medida empezó a regir a partir del 1 de enero. Ya a finales del mes de enero se había reducido ese monto a 99 millones, o sea, una reducción del 24%. Y en febrero se había reducido a 83.3 millones, o sea, bajó otro 16%. Entonces, se han ido tomando medidas para evitarlo, pero hay buena voluntad, pero no es seguro de que no haya otras operaciones que utilicen el sistema bancario, porque aparte de ello, lo que hay es la obligación de reportar toda operación que se considere sospechosa. Esa es la obligación que tienen los bancos, pero la sofisticación de las operaciones financieras, sobre todo las transferencias, el uso de tarjetas de débito, escapan un poco, creo yo, a los controles, y hay que mejorar un poco en la técnica de hacer auditoría sobre ese tipo de operaciones modernas. Gracias.
Go ahead.
Thank you for being here, actually. I am half Honduran, half American, so I'm very passionate about this. But on the subject, Don Eduardo, of youth, I serve on a lot of universities, boards, and if I can go ahead and just bring to the table the idea that we have a lot of universities that are interested in, making better relationships in Latin America. Most of our Ivy League schools have relationships in Asia, in Europe, and in other places, but not as strong in Latin America. And we actually have, at the Wharton Business School, we have trained a lot of our Latin American leaders. And I feel like maybe that, in a way, could be a good conversation to follow up on institutionalizing that relationship through education and through the youth movement. I think that could be something of interest. So, on that note, I mean, if you can say a few comments on that, and if we can talk a little bit later about bringing that relationship to the table.
Any other comments from the panelists about the set of questions that have been put out there? Por favor. If you could wait, Mark, can you hand the microphone over here?
Okay. Muchas gracias. Mi nombre es José Ángel Tolentino, vengo de El Salvador y quisiera recalcar, lo que ya expusieron nuestros colegas sobre el enorme interés y la preocupación que está al centro de nuestra visita y de nuestro trabajo que hoy estamos haciendo. Como lo dijo Enrique, pero yo quiero enfatizarlo nuevamente, nuestras sociedades se encuentran en un estado de guerra. Hemos salido a duras penas de conflictos armados civiles, como ustedes muy bien saben, que drenaron significativamente la capacidad productiva y de desarrollo futuro por décadas en nuestros países, y con muchas dificultades y con apoyos externos entramos a una fase de transición que ha sido muy complicada, muy compleja, pero que si uno mira hacia atrás ha tenido éxitos, también obviamente dificultades. Pues hoy nos encontramos en una guerra que no genera el impacto mediático como tenían los conflictos civiles en nuestro país. Recuerdo que en la época de la guerra civil, por distintas circunstancias, pero esto era motivo de titulares en la prensa europea, en la prensa latinoamericana y también acá en Estados Unidos. Pues hoy están muriendo más jóvenes, más mujeres, más adolescentes que durante los peores años del conflicto armado. De tal manera que cuando nosotros hablamos de lavado de dinero, cuando hablamos de crimen organizado, simple y sencillamente estamos hablando de nuestro futuro y de la calidad de país que queremos hacia adelante. Por tanto, esta no es una discusión banal, no es una discusión, aunque si bien tiene un soporte académico, para nosotros es un reto fundamental de cara al futuro de nuestros países. Hemos trabajado duramente, muchos de nosotros participamos en los procesos de paz, en los procesos de reconstrucción, y vemos con mucha preocupación cómo nuestras sociedades nuevamente están a la vuelta de la esquina de dar un salto hacia atrás. Por tanto, ese es el mensaje central que nosotros traemos. Descubrir, analizar y encontrar medidas de política, acciones concretas, regionales, para atajar de la mejor manera ese fenómeno, ese problema que está a la base de nuestras preocupaciones, creo que es la razón de nuestra visita. Y precisamente ese es el llamado que quisiéramos dejar, y ese va a ser el mensaje que vamos a tratar de trasladar con todas las autoridades y personas con quienes nos reunamos durante estos días. Muchas gracias.
Perhaps on that note, excuse me, Chuck, you wanted to say something. I'm sorry.
Briefly,
Yeah.
on the question of if there is progress in the awareness of the public that organized crime is a central problem to the society. And I just remember we have a little very atypical project of the Adenauer Foundation in Guatemala, which has to do with political training, but it's also with little micro coffee growers. And they have little fields. And so when they go to the cooperative, they receive probably 20 to 30% less of the money that they could receive if they hand over the coffee directly to the coyote. And that is a form of money laundering that is happening every day in Guatemala. And actually it destroys all kinds of societal organization or association movements in this productive sector. And I think that's when you see, coming back to your question, is there awareness about this as a problem? The coffee grower, if he can get the cash this day, and if he can get 30% more, he will do it, and he will not think about the consequences that that has for society. And this has to do with what mentioned Eduardo earlier. There is, in a kind of, I would put it, there is a partial state failure in providing basic public services. And of course, there the organized crime comes in, as I was trying to illustrate with this example. And if you add the idea that we're talking about very fragile societies that are post-conflict societies, the social tissue has been damaged very thoroughly. So I think that the awareness that organized crime is a huge problem for the development of a democratic state, that the citizen doesn't feel that this democratic state has given him a better life, is at least difficult to answer. The second question on the local level, I was referring more working with political parties on these issues in the corridors of the drug trafficking. And that poses a very special problem to us. I'm not saying that working on the local level would not have the same effects as on the national level, but in this on this specific topic, it was up to now easier to get an entry door to the discussion on organized crime and on money laundering on the national level.
Right. I think we've come to the end of our time. I'd like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for working with us and putting this event together, and I'd certainly like to thank all of the participants from Central America, especially Eddie Stein, Enrique Sainz, for doing this work, for doing it at some risk to themselves and to their colleagues, and for persisting in the effort to find out more and to develop the kinds of public policies nationally and regionally that could start to make a difference. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists.